I'm Annabelle Hayworth, I'm 35. I'm standing in the aisle of the Municipal Community Hall. There are folding chairs, a low stage, and a squeaking microphone. The smell of burnt coffee hangs like a shawl. Gavin Price, the auctioneer, is calling numbers, and the noise of paddles sounds like rain on tin. Lydia Hayworth, my older sister, sits front row with Caleb Morton, a real estate developer, and has her hand on his sleeve. Marable Khan, the planning commissioner, is near the exit, and church elders and neighbors make a tense semicircle. I let the last bid hang in the air. I feel the room go quiet. Then I say, $1, exactly as Mom wrote in her will. I do not flinch, I already know what comes next. Before I tell you how a chained gate, a fig tree, and $1 turned a town upside down, tell me where you're listening from. And be sure to subscribe and switch on notifications. The garden is a patchwork and a memory stitched together. It is rain barrels with quiet dents, crooked beds framed by old boards, a weathered gate that squeaks on summer mornings, and the fig tree that throws a wide, patient shade. I started there as a child with a watering can too big for my arms, trailing a line of damp footprints and watching the peppers grow fat as if they were making a promise. Mom taught me to plant in rows and to write the dates on tongue depressors so we could remember what we did and when. I learned to wait season by season and to plan like a map with keys for frost and sun. We had a ledger on the potting bench where I would write seed orders, note broken tools, and count volunteer hours. That ledger felt like a spine under my hands. It held the story of how we kept things from slipping. The garden gave me more than food. It gave me language for time, seed, sprout, prune, harvest. It gave me a measure for patience I could carry into rooms where people shouted. It taught me that proof mattered, receipts, names, signatures, and that if you wanted to make something last, you recorded it. I learned to mend the cracked spigot with wire and a stubborn jaw, and I learned to coax compost into warmth like a slow oven. Elena Flores hauled soil in the back of her truck like it was the most honest work in town. Agnes Porter checked our sign-in sheet with the same careful eye she used in church. Those small public acts made us visible. I wrote everything down because the garden and my role in it could be erased if no one could show the pages that said otherwise. Mom taught me everything important under the fig tree. Her voice would come out soft, even when she was firm. Plan like rain will fail, hope like rain will come. She held dirt between her fingers and showed me how to tell moisture by smell and color. She taught me to spot people who pretended to care, how their hands washed over plants like they were choosing props for a photograph, not partners for a season. She made us bring witnesses to big choices, neighbors, elders, a notary sometimes, because she trusted paper to hold what memory might not. Mom would say, if they try to erase you, write in ink and tap the binder she kept by the sink. Her will had no grand clauses, just clear lines, keep it a garden, let the people in. She said it like she was planting a seed that needed our hands to grow. She modeled a kind of calm that wasn't the same as giving up. If someone raised a voice, she would not match it. She would reposition the ground they were standing on until the argument lost its balance. She insisted on witnesses not because she wanted an audience, but because truth lives longer when others saw it happen. At the table, we would read seed catalogs and county notices, and she would ask me to read the small print aloud as if training me to hear traps. I learned to hear the difference between a promise and a plan. Mom taught me to plan with both hands, one hand in the soil, the other on the paper. That is how the ledger became not just a list of what we planted, but a map of how we would hold the garden against anyone who tried to take it away. She called the garden a hobby in parties where other people could hear. To some neighbors she said, casually, that it was underused land. Later she said it with more bite, like she expected the phrase to become a fact if she said it often enough. At holidays, she would walk through the beds like a guest and tell the same flattering, needful people how we had just gotten lucky with a grant or a donation, as if she had been the one to apply. I remember one winter when she took a framed flyer to her office and hung it by the break room coffee machine with her name on the bottom. I had written the grant application. I had called the suppliers and written the invoices. But Lydia was better at wrapping work in a ribbon and putting a name tag on it. She picked partners who rewarded shine and movement. They liked loud restaurants and bigger cars, and they liked saying things that impressed other people. She learned to trade the steady, invisible labor of care for applause and a sense of place at the top of the table. That meant the garden was always an obstacle, a patch of humility that would not translate into status on a LinkedIn page or a weekend party. As she moved toward choices that were louder and worthier in the currency she cared about, the garden smelled like damp work, and she hated that smell. She stopped coming to volunteer days. She started attending ribbon cuttings where ribbons were red and cameras were closer to her face. I watched her get good at erasure in small ways first, taking credit for events I organized, suggesting a remodeling idea and letting others think it was hers. Then her language hardened. She spoke of unlocking value and highest and best use like new prayers. I could see the math of it in her eyes, the way acreage and appraisal made her breath quick. It wasn't just greed. It was hunger for the kind of respect she'd been trained to win, visible, public, and quick. That hunger made her ready to cut a place that fed people into a line item that fed her. When she decided to sell, it felt to me like she was trading a living place for a title she could pin on her chest. Dad never raised a hand. He believed time would soften edges and that most things could be smoothed with small acts of kindness. He fixed the leaky roof and made sure there was always enough money for oil in the car. He kept household storms mostly without shouting. That calm left us a safer house, but it also taught Lydia that big blows could be avoided if you spoke loudly enough and made people feel like the quiet ones would not fight back. Dad's way of loving was about keeping peace at the dinner table and not making enemies at church. It meant he avoided public scenes and important confrontations, and when it came to the garden being threatened, he tended to stand at the edge with his hands in his pockets. His silence landed on me like a responsibility. I learned to move when he would not, to take a form to the county or call a contractor without asking whether he would help. There were times I wanted him to step into the middle to speak plainly to Lydia, to say, "This is not right." He didn't. Seeing him step back forced me to step forward. I stopped waiting for permission. I started keeping copies of everything and learning how to read the small print. Dad's avoidance didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like a hand turned away at a threshold. It pushed me to build a doorway I could keep closed if I needed to. I took his quiet as a kind of trust, even if it meant I had to be louder with my work than he ever had been. My years running the garden were mostly small, steady things that look boring until you need them. I organized volunteer days where people arrived in flannel and handprints and left with stained nails and new recipes for tomato sauce. I negotiated compost deliveries with men who smelled of diesel and treated me like an equal when I knew what I was talking about. I repaired the cracked spigot with a welded coupling and a roll of plumber's tape I learned to wrap just so. I logged every hour volunteers spent and wrote down names and phone numbers and notes about who could handle heavy lifting. That attendance sheet saved us once when a city inspector asked for proof of regular community involvement. Agnes Porter and Alina Flores signed without fuss because they had always been there. I read forms aloud to Mom at the kitchen table when she asked me to. We'd spread county pamphlets and zoning notices across the Formica like maps, and I'd underline sentences and ask, "Does this mean we have to?" And she'd nod and say, "Write it down." Those sessions taught me to speak plainly about law and not let legal language scare me. I learned to file things at the county clerk's office, to ask for stamped copies, to photograph everything with a phone and back up the files in 2 places. I built relationships with neighbors so that when a question came up, a neighbor could be a witness, and Agnes could be a voice people listened to. I invited Maribel Khan to walk the paths and point out the garden's public value. She came and saw the compost bins and the kids' plots and the fig tree and said, plainly, "This matters." It was never about being the face of the garden. Lydia liked that role more than I did. For me, the work was its own reward, the quiet hour at dawn when the soil was moist and the world smelled like turned earth, the way the figs flashed in the afternoon like small green lanterns. I kept the ledger because I wanted the garden to outlast us, and because someone had to hold the records if anyone tried to speak louder than the truth. I learned that when you keep the paper, you also keep the story. That was a foundation I would later turn into something stronger than a story, a rule others would have to follow. To me, that $1 was not sentimental, it was instruction. It was Mom laying out in plain terms how to choose the outcome she wanted and giving whoever loved the place more than they loved a nice title a key. Lydia heard a joke, I heard a clause, I asked for copies before we left. I asked the lawyer to give me recorded pages, stamped and folded into an envelope. Lydia rolled her eyes when I asked for a paper copy of the will the next week and put the envelope in her handbag like it was a souvenir. I laminated a copy, then made a binder labeled Fig Tree and slipped that laminated will into the front like a map. Mom liked simplicity and she trusted ink. She had never been one for grand legal theater. She wanted everyday safeguards. The will echoed what she had said under the fig tree 100 times: record things, bring witnesses, do the work of making things last. So I treated the will as a blueprint. I inventoried what it meant in practical steps, what filings would actually protect access, what ownership of the gate would matter, what words in an easement would hold up if someone tried to move a bulldozer through our history. I did not want to romanticize her wording, I wanted to follow it. The will gave me permission to act and a voice that would speak in a room where tempers and titles could otherwise drown out truth. My wound was small and steady, like a leak you notice only when you stop to listen. I had become useful and invisible. People depended on me for fixing things and showing up, but I was rarely the name on a sign or the person who got the photograph. That invisibility tasted like being spoken over at family dinners, and the fear was that Mom's work would be turned into a line item and my hours would be footnotes in someone else's speech. I promised myself that I would not let that happen. I decided the kind of response that did not feel like revenge for its own sake but like a correction, precise and public. I would not yell, I would not beg. I would set the rules where they mattered and make the room follow them. When I started to move, it was slow and deliberate, like planting in late autumn. I needed proof and I needed witnesses. The first confirmatory moment was the phone call I overheard through the kitchen wall. Lydia's laugh, then jarred Blake's voice on the other end, the kind that sounds pleased when someone else counts money. "It'll be gone by spring," Lydia said, and the certainty in her voice had the flatness of someone reading a script. That sentence tightened something in my chest. I set down the kettle and pretended I had not heard. Later, I would use the exact words she meant as evidence. I built a small theater of passes. I invented a need for a break at the community center so Lydia would believe I was stepping back. I left messages and let some volunteers assume I was burned out. That false quiet made her feel brash and safe. I began watching her public voice, her social posts, the way she wrote unlocking value and praised highest and best use. I saved screenshots. Words matter, and she spoke them as if they were blueprints. I called Gavin Price's office under the name of a volunteer who wanted to check the schedule. I asked about dates and procedures and listened carefully to the cadence of auction days. Gavin was blunt and practical on the phone, the kind of man who liked to let a gavel speak. I noted the auction date and the registration deadline and wrote them in the fig tree binder with a pen that would not smear. I did not confront Lydia. Confrontation would give her the stage. Instead, I filled the pages of my binder with dates and record numbers and the quiet proofs Mom taught me to collect. I circled the auction date twice and put a small sticky note that said only, Arena. I had chosen the room where rules were enforced and witnesses were present, and I would make that choice mean everything. Priya tested every idea the way a gardener tests soil, pinch it, smell it, stand back and see if it holds water. She pointed out weak spots and asked what a developer like Caleb Morton would do when he saw an obstacle. She told me to imagine every likely move and build the response into the paper. That was the part Mom had taught me under the fig tree plan for the season when things turn dry. Priya liked the idea of a reversion clause. She liked the simplicity of a right of first purchase that matched the will's $1. She warned me that the words had to be clear in order to be useful. I wrote down sample language and then she rewrote it so a neighbor could read it aloud at the auction and not stutter. I also needed people who knew how to bear witness without making a fuss. I asked Alina Flores to meet with Priya one afternoon in the garden, and I watched them walk the beds together like two people counting tomatoes. Alina nodded when Priya explained in plain words what a recorded easement would do. Agnes Porter came by with her church calendar and her steady, careful questions. I did not tell them everything. I simply asked them if they would sign a statement that they understood the garden's public value and would be willing to act as witnesses if needed. They said yes without drama. They were the sort of people who signed things because they thought it was the decent thing to do, and their decency would matter later when the room needed to see honest faces. Buying the frontage strip felt like buying a hinge. The parcel was a thin finger of land that touched the garden gate and nobody had kept an eye on it. It had a fence that lined and an old "no trespassing" sign that had seen better decades. I found the owner in county records one late afternoon while rain tapped the window of my kitchen. The phone call was polite. The owner had moved away and didn't want the hassle. I offered a fair price, nothing dramatic, and she accepted. We signed where the county wanted us to sign, and I drove the signed form to the clerk's office the same day with a feeling like carrying a fragile lamp. When the deed was recorded, I felt a small, sharp relief. The clerk stamped the paper with an honest, loud thump, and I watched him slide the stamped copy back to me as if it were a key. Priya checked the book and page numbers twice like she was counting seeds into a packet. I took the recorded copy and slipped it into the fig tree binder and traced the line on the map with my finger, visualizing how the gate now sat on land with my name attached. I changed nothing about the gate. I did not replace the lock or put a notice on the post. Lydia had to keep thinking the gate was the same old gate. The hinge had moved into my pocket and I planned to turn it only when I was ready. Drafting the conservation easement was the part where paper became promise. Priya and I sat at her desk with a fresh document and a pot of terrible office coffee and wrote what would be allowed and what would not. We used plain words. Community agriculture meant plots, compost, shared tools, and public access during posted hours. It did not mean parking lots or storage yards or condominiums. We wrote examples. We listed things that would be forbidden and underlined the phrase community agriculture so there would be no squinting at the text later. We added a reversion clause that said if the allowed use changed to anything other than community agriculture, the access provided through my frontage would automatically end and revert to the owner recorded on the deed. Priya said it snaps back, and I liked that image, clean and final. We brought in witnesses for the paperwork like Mom taught us to bring witnesses for big decisions. Elena and Agnes walked the edges of the paper and signed as witnesses to our intent. We notarized the signatures in a small room with a clock that hummed and a window that looked over Main Street. Then we recorded the easement at the county recorder's office the same day because timing matters. The clerk's stamp on that document felt like a bell. I made copies, digital backups, and 3 physical piles, one for my binder, one for Priya, and one couriered to Gavin Price with a neutral envelope that said "for records." I did not tell Lydia. I left the gate where it had always been and let the fig tree shade the same old path. The paper was quiet, but under the quiet it was doing its work. We drafted a right of first purchase in language that echoed Mom's will. The sentence was short and stubborn. If the parcel containing the garden is offered for sale in a way that preserves community agriculture, the Fig Tree Land Trust has the right to buy it for $1. Priya said the phrase aloud in the bakery office to make sure it sounded like a sentence someone could read and understand in one breath. We added a line that the price was symbolic and final, no haggling, no surprises. That $1 was not a joke, it was an instruction and a test. It said plainly who the land was for and who could step in when someone tried to change its use. I opened a bank account for the trust in a quiet branch on a Tuesday morning. I put in enough to cover filing fees, the initial taxes, and a small buffer for emergencies. I didn't make a big display of it. I wanted the trust to be a working thing, not a headline. I printed simple brochures with the mission statement and a fold that looked official but was not meant for mass distribution. They had the trust's name, the trustees' contact information, and a short paragraph about community agriculture and the will. I put a stack in my glove compartment and one in the fig tree binder. The trust lived mostly in paperwork at first, but it felt like a container for what I hoped to keep safe. Then I built the paper trail the way you would build a fence, with posts at regular intervals so nothing could slip through. Priya told me to courier stamped copies of the recorded easement and the trust's right of first purchase to Gavin Price at his auction office. I printed copies, stamped and notarized, and folded them into plain envelopes marked for records. I photographed the envelopes before I left the house, then took them to the courier, watched the clerk scan the tracking numbers, and logged delivery times on a page in my binder. The courier receipt went into a plastic sleeve with the deed and the easement copy. It felt small and bureaucratic and also like armor. I sent certified copies to Lydia too, with a neutral subject line. For your file, I didn't write anything dramatic in that envelope, no gloating, no explanation, because I wanted the silence to do work for me. I watched the postal scan when it happened and circled the date in the fig tree binder. I wanted all the statutory windows for objections to pass quiet and unremarked, so I calendared every deadline in 3 places: my phone, a paper calendar in the kitchen, and a red tabbed page in the binder. Priya checked the dates again and asked what I would do if someone filed a caveat. I told her I would face it with copies and witnesses. She nodded and underlined the pages like a gardener staking a new row. For auction day, I prepared a binder that could speak faster than I could. Tabs labeled gate, easement, right, deed, each with the recorded copies tucked behind clear plastic. I put a 1-page summary of the legal effect on top of each tab so a neighbor could hand it to someone and not stumble over the language. I practiced flipping to each tab until my fingers knew where the pages lived. I practiced the small motions, closing the binder, tucking a hair behind my ear, standing up from my chair, all of them rehearsed so the moment would not feel like improvisation. I wanted the reveal to be a demonstration, not a show. I thought about stagecraft like a gardener thinks about sunlight. I mapped where Lydia would sit, where Caleb Morton would plant himself, where the officials would stand. I chose a seat in the aisle 2 rows back so my voice could carry without the microphone. I wanted Gavin to need me to repeat a thing if he chose. I did not want him forced to listen. I asked Alina to invite neighbors and volunteers under the pretense of moral support. She did it with the kindness she gives everything, by knocking on doors and handing people a folded note like a quiet promise. Agnes and Ruth agreed to come and stand near the back where they would be seen. I didn't tell them the trick, I only asked them to be present. I texted Maribel Khan a plain reminder about the auction and the public value of community spaces and asked if she could attend. She replied with a single yes and a time she would arrive. That yes settled something in me like a stake in the ground. I chose the sentence I would use for the reveal and practiced it until the words were the easiest shape my mouth made. $1, as Mom wrote. I timed my phone alarms for likely bid plateaus, the moments when bidders catch their breath and the room goes quiet. My fingers hovered over the binder the way I'd learned to steady a spade. The plan's success depended on quiet precision more than spectacle. I wanted the room to see the documents and understand them in a single breath. so I packed a single sheet with bullet points that explained access, reversion, and the trusts right in plain words. I put that sheet where I could draw it and hand it to Gavin if he asked, or to Maribel if she needed to say something official. I rehearsed handing it over like I was passing a tool to a neighbor. Calm, unhurried, with the confidence that it would be useful. On auction day, I would sit with the binder in my lap and watch the light on the floorboards and the way Lydia's smile pinned around Caleb's sleeve. I would wait for the quiet, and when it came, I would open my mouth and speak as if I were reading the label on a seed packet. The stagecraft was not about theatrics. It was about placing facts where a crowd could not pretend they did not exist. I wanted the room to lean in and read the pages that Mom had already written, and to find in ink what she had planted in the soil. I grieved quietly for Dad's refusal to step into the fight. He had always been the kind of man who avoided making enemies. He fixed the roof and kept the car running and told us, without flourish, to pick our battles. Watching him step back when Lydia leaned forward hurt like a bruise you notice when you lift your arm. But his silence made me sharper. If he would not speak up, I would make sure the words he didn't say were written down in a way that could not be ignored. I carried his quiet like a map that told me which roads I could not take and which ones I had to build. There were nights I slept in short, broken bursts, waking to the memory of a gate swinging empty. I learned to turn that tiredness into ritual, a walk around the garden at dawn, hands on the porch rail, breathing in damp soil and making lists in my head. I would count the tools, check the compost levels, touch the ledger in my pocket. I visited Mom's resting place and sat for a while with my forehead against cold stone, whispering the plan to her as if she could still steady me with the same hands that taught me how to prune. I asked her for patience, for clarity, and for the steadiness to let the facts do the talking. I promised myself no grand gloating. There was a part of me that wanted to dance at the gate and fling papers into the air, but I put that part away. Precision would be my voice. I practiced the lines I would use until they felt like the most natural sentences in a packet of seeds, short, exact, and plainly useful. I rehearsed the small gestures too, how to hold the binder so pages flipped without rustling, how to press a document into someone's hands so they would look at it. I wanted the moment to feel inevitable, not theatrical. I wanted the room to meet the paper and not the person. The practical costs were small but constant. Filing fees, courier bills, a bank account that needed 2 signatures and a quiet ledger of its own, those things were reminders that stewardship is work. I set aside evenings for paperwork and mornings for the garden. I lost casual weekends to meetings with Priya, with Alina, with Agnes. Friends asked if I was becoming a zealot. I told them I was being careful, and they nodded as if they understood, some with relief in their shoulders. I learned to carry uncertainty lightly and to check the facts twice. The rhythm steadied me more than any vindication could. On the day itself, I dressed to be present and not to perform, comfortable shoes for standing, a sweater that would not snag on folding chair backs, a binder with corners softened by use. I slept poorly the night before but woke with the same slow breathing practice and a list of small tasks. Check the tabs, make sure the coin was in my pocket, text Alina a reminder. I walked through the garden one last time that morning, feeling the earth cool and the fig tree's shadow burn a soft seam across the path. Control, I reminded myself, was not about vanquishing people. It was about arranging facts so they could not be denied. The municipal hall smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish. Folding chairs chirped as people sat and shifted. A fluorescent light hummed in a corner like a small insect. Gavin Price worked the front like a conductor, testing the microphone, calling out sample lot numbers and letting the echo fill the space. I timed his cadence the way I used to time watering, listen for the beat and use it to pace your action. Lydia moved through that space as if she owned it, slipping into the front row with a practiced smile that collected attention. She greeted people with a brightness that read like currency, handing out hellos the way others hand out business cards. Caleb Morton scanned the room with a developer's eye, measuring exits, counting people, noting where a truck might turn if it needed to. He had the posture of a man waiting to claim something he thought was inevitable. He registered his bidder's paddles with the kind of economy that said he wanted speed and dominance. Lydia leaned toward him and laughed in the way people laugh when they are already picturing the ribbon cutting. Around them, the church elders sat like a cautious audience, folding their hands and letting their presence speak. Marable Khan stood near the exit, clipboard tucked under her arm, looking as if she might step in at any moment to clarify something with gravity and fairness. I sat 2 rows back in the aisle so my voice could carry and my hands could move without calling attention before the time. The binder rested on my lap, tabs arranged like a map I could read by touch. I checked them by feeling the edges. Gate, easement, right, deed, each one with a different thickness and a different smell of paper. Elena and Agnes arrived and sat near the back, their faces familiar and calm, and Ruth came with a coat that smelled faintly of mothballs and old photos. Small, solid people who do honest things just as Mom had taught me to bring. I kept my phone face down and quiet, and I let the room fill with the low shuffling of anticipation. Lydia had been telling her story for weeks. She told Jard and anyone else who would listen that the neighborhood will thank me, like some benevolent ruler returning a gift. She called the garden underused land, as if repetition would transform an acre of beds and compost into an empty box waiting for a label. On social posts, she wrote phrases like unlocking value and highest and best use, the exact kind of language that sounds practical until you realize it erases people. She rehearsed lines about bringing investment and opportunity, and she said them with a neatness that made some in the room nod because the words felt like business. When she glanced at me, it was with the pity she reserves for people she thinks are quaint. It never occurred to her that her language would undo her in a room where witnesses could read paper as well as listen to speeches. Her narrative was designed for applause, short, punchy, and future-facing. It needed a crowd that would not see what the space under the fig tree had grown over decades. Kids learning patience, neighbors sharing tomatoes, hands calloused from honest work. Her words were easy to repeat, and that was their danger. They could be mouthed into a headline while everything they described disappeared. I knew those lines would snap like brittle twine when the room saw the documents I had prepared, and that certainty steadied me more than any last-minute adrenaline. People tested him. A retiree to my left held a paddle up and chuckled. A couple from the church raised theirs like they were casting a ballot. The bids rose in a rhythm I knew from years of watching donation drives. Quick climb, tentative hold, a jab from someone who thought the room would follow his lead. Lydia sat forward, smiling the way an actor does when the applause is supposed to start. Jard leaned back and blinked slowly, his posture asking for escalation. Every time Caleb pushed, the room shifted, neighbors leaned in, Agnes Porter folded her hands tighter, Elena's knuckles whitened on her program. Gavin repeated numbers twice and let a moment hang as if to force people to commit. I tracked the cadence like a metronome. 3 raises, 1 pause, 2 raises, the long breath. Marable watched with her clipboard close to her chest. She did not speak, but her presence felt like a rule in the room. I kept my fingers on the binder in my lap, feeling the tabs through the cover, knowing where gate and easement and right would live if I needed them. I did not open it. Opening it would be premature. For now I took notes in my head, who was pushing, who was hesitant, who sat perfectly still and unreadable. The waiting game was less about patience than about heat. The room warmed as more numbers went up. The fluorescent lights hummed, and there was a faint smell of someone's perfume mixed with coffee. You could feel anticipation as a weight on the backs of chairs. I watched Lydia's shoulders loosen with each successful bid and thought about how visible her smile had become in the currency she sought. She relaxed enough to brush Caleb's sleeve at one point, a small motion that stole oxygen from anyone near her. The church elders exchanged looks, a language of careful worry. Elena's mouth pressed into a thin line. Agnes folded her program and tapped it quietly against her knee. I calibrated myself against the stillness I wanted to create. I practiced slowing my heartbeat by pressing my tongue against my teeth, an old trick that made my voice steady. I imagined the binder under my hand like a cold stone I could steady my palm on. I counted small things to keep from fidgeting, the number of ridges in the wood of the chair ahead, the faint scuff near Gavin's podium where he always sets his foot. The pause before someone raises a paddle is the place where decisions clarify. Either momentum carries the bid higher or it breaks. I let the room breathe into that pause, waited for the point where triumph would become arrogance. That was the moment I needed. The trigger came in the quiet after a particularly bold number. Gavin's gavel hovered as if undecided, his hand lifted half a beat too long before he looked toward the audience. You could see Caleb's paddle dip, the small surrender of a man who expected resistance to fold. Lydia leaned in, already tasting the victory. Silence fell like a curtain. I counted 3 steady beats and stood, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders and gather under my voice. $1, I said, the words shaped the way Mom had written them, simple and absolute. The sound of the room changing was immediate, paddles lowered, heads turned, 1,000 small movements orienting toward me. Gavin blinked, the microphone catching the unexpectedness and making it louder in replay. "You'll have to repeat that, ma'am," he said, more curious than hostile. I did not move. $1, I repeated, slower, and added, "The Fig Tree Land Trust holds a recorded right of first purchase at $1 for community agriculture." The binder sat in my left hand like a tool. I tapped it lightly as if to say it would open when required. Lydia laughed, sharp, the kind of laugh used to shrink others, and a few people turned at the sound as if it might be a signal to hurry. I did not hurry. I let the paper speak by opening the cover and letting the room see the neat stamps and the columned entries Mom had always insisted on. Dates, clerk stamps, signatures. The air seemed to tighten as the legal words made their slow climb into common understanding, and in that tightening I heard the soft sound of Lydia's plan beginning to unravel. Gavin looked at me with curiosity that had a shade of duty. "You'll have to repeat that, ma'am," he said, voice sliding between polite and puzzled. I did not change the words. $1, I said, and then I added the fact I knew would make calm people sit up straight. "The Fig Tree Land Trust holds a recorded right of first purchase at $1 for community agriculture on this parcel." The sentence was plain. The room shifted in that specific way a crowd does when it realizes that something it thought casual is not casual at all. Lydia's face changed in a second from triumph to confusion as if someone had removed a prop. Caleb's jaw tightened. Jard's phone came up to his chin like a small shield. Maribel, standing by the exit with her clipboard, moved forward just enough that you could see she had heard the words with the weight she usually reserved for council debates. Agnes, Porter, and Elena shifted in their chairs. Elena's fingers found the edge of the program and squeezed it once, the same way she squeezes a tomato to test ripeness. I pushed my binder forward with both hands and opened it to the gate tab as if unfolding a map. The deed was first. I slid the recorded copy toward Gavin, laying it on the podium so the microphone just caught the rustle of paper. The drawing of the frontage strip was clear. A narrow finger of land touching the gate, shaded in a light pencil where the property line met the chain link. The clerk's stamp sat in the corner like a small, official heartbeat, date, book, page. Priya had insisted we get the copy stamped the same day. We recorded it so nothing could be argued about later. Gavin turned the page and his eyes narrowed the way someone reads an ingredient list. He looked up at me and then at Maribel, who nodded minutely and mouthed, "Check the dates." I flipped to the easement tab and let the paper fall open. The easement language was simple because we had made it simple on purpose. We defined community agriculture in plain words: plots for neighbors, composting, shared tools, posted hours. We wrote what it did not allow: parking lots, storage yards, housing developments, because specificity leaves less room for smoke and mirrors. The reversion clause was underlined in blue ink. It said that if the access was used for anything other than community agriculture, the access would end and the frontage would revert to the owner named on the deed. It snaps back. I told the room in the language Priya had used when she wanted me to visualize clarity, and some people smiled at that image because it sounded tidy and fair. I showed Gavin the recorded easement and the pages with notary seals. He turned them like someone handling delicate plates. Then I slid the trust tab forward and set the Fig Tree Land Trust's right of first purchase in front of him. The paper had Priya's neat paragraph: any sale that preserves community agriculture gives the trust the option to buy for $1. The sentence was short, stubborn, and exactly what Mom had written in the will in softer language. I tapped the paragraph as if to make sure it was noticed. Gavin compared stamps and dates, then read aloud the key phrases into the microphone, careful and measured, as if he were reading the minutes for posterity. The sound in the room became a new animal once Gavin started to speak the recorded words. He read the deed description, the easement's restrictions, the reversion clause, and the trust's right. Hearing legal language out loud can be disorienting. Hearing it read slowly and plainly is clarifying. I had 3 watermarked copies. I handed one to Marable, one to Gavin for the auction record, and kept one in my binder. Marable's face lost the tired neutrality she keeps for council meetings. She folded the paper just enough to carry it and said, in a voice that carried the authority of someone used to making official statements, "For the record, the easement and right of first purchase are recorded documents with county stamps. They affect access to the parcel." I watched Lydia's friends step back. Caleb whispered something that was half question and half calculation into her ear, but the look he gave was not the same as the one he had worn when counting dollar signs earlier. People in the room began talking to one another in low voices, the way neighbors do when a sudden truth rearranges afternoon plans. Agnes let out a single that sounded like satisfaction, and a woman near the back repeated a phrase I had practiced: "No trucks, no bulldozers," like someone checking a list. I put the coin on the podium and let it sit next to the deed. It was a small, deliberate act. Metal and paper together, Mom's instruction in my hand and its proof beside it, made the moment simple and impossible to ignore. Then I explained what the documents meant in plain, practical terms so anyone who had not grown up reading county records could follow along. Without lawful access to the gate, the rectangle of land Lydia wanted to sell becomes landlocked in the plainest sense. No way for construction equipment to enter, no place to lay basic utility lines, no accessible entrance for materials and trucks. It's not about magic words. It's about the physical fact that without that narrow frontage you can't stage a build. You can own a plot, but if you do not have a legal path to bring in the heavy things a builder needs, you have a plot that cannot be developed in the way developers expect. I said it simply so a retiree and a council member and a developer could all repeat it. Then I explained how the reversion worked, also plainly. The easement lets you use the frontage to get into the garden for community agriculture. If someone tries to change that use to something else, parking, storage, housing, then, because of the way the easement and deed are written together, the legal access ends. The frontage ownership doesn't disappear, but the right to use it for anything other than community agriculture vanishes. That is the safety switch. It protects the garden by making the cost of changing it a practical impossibility for anyone who wants to build. I used short sentences and examples: no bulldozers, no delivery trucks, no hookups, so people could say it out loud and understand its consequence. By the time I finished, the room had reassembled itself around a new axis. People were reading the stamped pages, comparing dates, whispering the same simple conclusions. Gavin checked his copy for the auction record. Marable put her pen to paper like she was already preparing a letter of support, and in a corner, Lydia gathered herself with the air of someone realizing a stage prop had been swapped for a brick wall. The facts were not dramatic, but they were immovable, and that is exactly what I had come to make them. You could see the edges of Lydia's status peel away in the room. She'd relied on the speed of a narrative, say it first, make it feel true, and that speed had worked until paper slowed things down. People who'd nodded at her plans now held stamped documents like talismans. The church elders shifted their gaze away from her and toward the papers and then toward me, as if they were weighing two kinds of testimony, one loud and hopeful, the other quiet and recorded. Marable's expression, the one she'd trained in council chambers, tightened into that precise, almost judicial look. She had the posture of someone who could make a sentence stick in minutes and hours to come. When she stood and spoke, it felt like a gavel even though she had no hammer. Gavin cleared his throat and began to read the filings aloud into the microphone, and the hollow room filled with sound that now had the shape of law. He read the deed description, the easement restrictions, and the trust's right of first purchase, the phrases that mattered repeated with the flatness of someone doing their job. People listened the way you listen to a weather report that changes the day's plans. When he read the line about the reversion clause the way we had worded it, a woman in the back whispered, "So it just stops," and someone else answered, "Yeah, no trucks, no driveways." That plainness did work in our favor. Complex things become simple when you say them slowly and without flourish. Gavin then announced what the filings required. He said into the microphone and into the room that the Fig Tree Land Trust held a recorded right of first purchase at $1 for the parcel if it preserved community agriculture. And because the current bids were for non-garden use, and because the access we had recorded was essential for development, the trust's right was triggered. His voice had the authority of a man reading the minutes. I slid the coin forward and placed it on the podium where everyone could see it, a small, ordinary metal thing that had Mom's meaning stamped into it by our family conversation rather than by any legal emblem. It felt oddly ceremonial and not at all theatrical. It was simply the fulfillment of the clause. Gavin asked me to hand over proof of the trust, and I pushed the trust documents across in a neat stack. He checked the names, compared the clerk's stamps, and announced that he would accept the trust's $1 bid to preserve garden use. He recorded the transaction in the auction minutes with a precise hand, noting book and page numbers and the county clerk's stamp references. Marable stepped forward and, with the sort of measured voice that people listen to in council meetings and which they seemed to need now, affirmed the public value of the garden and acknowledged the recorded filings. Her words solidified the moment in a way shard-like rumors never could. She spoke for the record, which was the kind of thing both neighbors and bureaucrats respect. Then the room split into small clusters of low conversation. People who had been leaning toward Lydia's plan now talked about logistics, who would plant the fall cover crop when a site walk could be scheduled, how to post signs. A woman near the back repeated the essential sentence, "No access for non-garden use," like someone testing to make sure she understood it well enough to tell a friend who might ask later. Agnes came to stand near the podium, folding her hands with that quiet energy she reserves for practical tasks rather than praise. Elena's eyes met mine and she mouthed, without sound, "Thank you," as if everything I had done had been a quieter version of rescue. Lydia did not take it well. Her first impulse was outrage. She rose and demanded a redo, her voice pitched to regain the stage she thought hers. "You can't just," she began, then stopped when Gavin pointed to the minutes and said clearly that the filings were recorded and that the auction record would reflect what he'd just read. The protocol was on his side now. He had read the recorded documents aloud and entered the trust's acceptance into the official record. There was no face-saving redo offered in those minutes. The law, public and stamped, moves slowly and then refuses to budge. Caleb muttered something about meeting elsewhere and stood, shrugging as he gathered his coat. He looked back once, but his eyes found practical things, exits, his car keys, rather than the gate. Jard slipped out under the pretense of an important call. His walk carried the stiff rhythm of a man who knows a deal has just gone sideways and plans to call someone who might fix it. In the space of 5 minutes, the room lost the air of an audience for Lydia and turned into a working group for the garden. The church elders avoided her gaze the way people avoid stepping on fragile things. One of them, who had admired Lydia's capacity for organizing lunches at the church, simply walked past her and went to Agnes to ask about volunteer sign-ups. That bypass felt like a small public shaming, the kind that doesn't require words. Lydia gathered herself for a moment as if to salvage the scene and then left. She did not take the long way by the gate, she left through the main doors without looking back. I saw the short motion of her chin as she passed me, brief, like a name written on the back of a receipt, and that was the last acknowledgement she gave the place she once called a hobby. After she left, the room's energy softened. People clustered around practical things again. An older man asked if he could plant a plot for his grandson, a woman offered to bring seedlings, and a council member scribbled a note to follow up with Marable. I sat very still and let the small motor of neighborhood action start. There was no triumph in my face, only a long, steadying breath that felt like the garden itself inhaling. The record was made. Lydia's demand had been denied, and the social currency she chased drained away in the quiet that followed. The work of stewardship began immediately, as it always did, small, unglamorous, necessary, and I moved toward it with the ledger I had always carried. Conversations stopped being about sales and starts being about schedules. A young teacher asked if she could bring her students for a planting lesson. A man who'd come because he liked Lydia's talk about investment asked how he could help with irrigation lines. Someone suggested a rotating stewardship schedule so no single person felt the whole weight of care. I made notes on the back of the auction program: names, availability, who could haul soil, who could teach kids how to plant seeds. Agnes offered to coordinate the volunteer days and said she'd announce them after Sunday service. Marable told me she'd set up a site walk for the planning office so officials could see the garden's value firsthand. The room filled with small plans and polite hands offering time. It was ordinary civic work, the kind that smells like dirt and coffee and involves a lot less paperwork than you think, but it mattered. I unchained the gate a week later with a key that felt like a small instrument of promise. I replaced the old padlock with a new one and left a set of keys with Alina, Agnes, and Ruth, people I trusted because they'd been in the beds with me and because they'd stand in the garden when things needed watching. I posted simple rules on a weatherproof board nailed to the fence: posted hours, plot assignment procedure, composting guidelines, a reminder to clean tools after use. I made the rules short and clear so they could be read in a glance: keep plots tended, keep shared tools clean, harvest what you plant, no exclusive storage. I wanted the rules to feel like instructions for a shared kitchen, not a lecture from a city hall. I kept the ledger in a metal box by the shed because proof had always been my friend. The binder sat inside, organized and stamped, with copies of the deed, the easement, and the trust paperwork. I told Dad I had it handled when he stopped by one afternoon to see how the garden looked now that people were back. He touched the edge of the ledger like he was checking a familiar map and nodded once, relief softening his face in a way he rarely let anyone see. I did not tell him about Lydia. There was no reason to pull that thread in front of him. He patted my shoulder, a quiet approval, and walked the rows with me, asking about the compost. His silence felt less like absence and more like a blank space I could fill with action. I made the access rules simple and enforceable. Only those with an assigned plot or a volunteer role could bring in heavy equipment, and any coordinated work needing trucks or contractors had to be scheduled through the trust so the easement's purpose would be clear. I set office hours for the trust, one evening a month at the community center and the first Saturday of each month at the garden for anyone to ask questions. I told people the binder would be available for anyone to read in the trust's office hours because transparency disarms rumor. When someone asked why I didn't make the trust a dramatic public statement, I said I preferred the quiet kind of power that made the paperwork do the talking and the neighbors do the work. On the financial side, I met with Priya to close the loop. We filed final copies of the auction minutes and delivered a formal packet to the county recorder's office showing the trust's acceptance of the $1 purchase. Priya made sure everything had book and page references and that the trust's articles were on file. I wrote a check to open the trust's bank account properly and deposited the $1 coin into it. Symbolic, yes, but also a clear line between intent and execution. We set up the trust account so 2 trustee signatures were required for withdrawals. Small withdrawals would be for seeds, soil, and tool repairs, and larger disbursements would need a meeting and a recorded vote. I sketched a simple maintenance budget in plain numbers: annual soil amendment costs, a line for water and a line for tool repairs, a small reserve for emergency replacements. I put estimates and a note about seeking small donations from neighbors on the clipboard and left it leaning against the shed where people would see it. Priya helped me draft an annual report template that summarized volunteer hours, maintenance expenses, and a short narrative about who used the garden and what they grew. I plan to post that report at the community board and on the small bulletin near the fig tree so anyone could see how we spent funds and how many hands were in the dirt. We scheduled an annual easement review on the calendar the way you schedule a physical checkup: regular, routine, and unremarkable until someone needs the record. Priya and I agreed to perform a legal audit every 3 years to confirm the language still held up and to make adjustments if the law changed in ways that mattered. I also prepared a short letter for the community board explaining the outcome of the auction and the steps we were taking to manage the garden. The letter was factual, printed on plain paper, and posted where the meeting minutes were usually clipped. I did not celebrate with a parade or a speech. When neighbors said thank you, I accepted their gratitude with a nod and a quiet smile. That was enough. The work of stewardship had always been small and consistent: mending, planting, counting, and recording. The legal closure felt like setting a fence post in firm ground. I kept the coin in the trust's petty cash slot and the ledger in the metal box. The garden would need a winter cover crop and spring seedlings and hands in the beds, and I would be there for those things because I had promised Mom I would keep the work alive, and because the garden had given me a voice that would not fade when louder people tried to speak over it. There was another reason. If I had warned her, she would have had time to rewrite the script. She would have called a meeting, staged a community event, and spun a narrative so neat it would have drowned the facts. The garden had always lived in small acts and public records, and opposing it on its own terms would have left us arguing about sentiment and charity. I needed rules to speak louder than please. Mom taught me to write in ink and to bring witnesses. Her will didn't beg, it instructed. I followed that instruction. I wanted the moment to be irreversible in the way an official record is irreversible, there and then, with stamps and a coin and people who could say they saw it happen. Finally, I didn't warn them because I wanted the community to choose. If the choice had happened behind closed doors, the neighbors would have only heard a rumor later. I wanted them in the room to watch status shift in real time so the authority Lydia collected would be visible on its knees. That public correction mattered more than any private victory. It taught that respect earned through spectacle is fragile, and that work backed by records and witnesses can be steadier than applause. I made the room the jury because the room had been the audience for her stories for years. Power, for me, is narrower and quieter than the versions I grew up watching. It is not shouting, it is design. It's the kind of power that sets the rules at the start so the game cannot be rigged in the middle. It is placing a deed where a bulldozer needs it and an easement where a truck must pass, so that practical facts guide what people can and cannot do. Power now means having a binder in a metal box and knowing which page to open. It means being able to tell a neighbor, plainly, why a contractor cannot stage on our gate and having the county clerk stamp to back that sentence. It is also the confidence to hand over a simple sheet that explains, in short phrases, what access means and what reversion means, and trust that people will read it and repeat it. Power is the quiet authority that makes someone else lower a paddle. It is the choice to not gloat when the room turns to practical work, because the aim was never humiliation for its own sake but protection that lasts. Power after this feels like weatherproofed planning, steady, useful, and readable by anyone who shows up. If there's one set of things I want anyone listening to take away, it's practical and small. Keep records. Write down who did what and when and get stamped copies at county offices. Learn the simple parts of the law that touch your life, ownership records, recorded easements, deeds, and rights that can be filed so they become visible to anyone who might try to change things later. Build allies who care about function over drama, neighbors, church elders, teachers, people who will stand and tell the truth without a spotlight. Choose the arena that already has witnesses and rules, a council meeting, a recorded sale, a public auction, because those rooms make it harder for stories to outrun documents. When you suspect erasure, design rather than yell. Buy the hinge that matters, record the promise that protects, and make sure the papers are stamped and couriered to the right desks. Keep things simple and explain them in plain words so anyone in the room can repeat them. And finally, when someone tries to erase what you've built, engrave. Leave proof in ink, in files, and in people who saw it happen. That way, when they try to sell the story, you can sell the record instead. Summer will be harvest and recipes pinned to the bulletin board. I can already see neighbors trading jars of tomato sauce and swapping tips under the fig tree shade. I want a small bulletin board there with Mom's sayings handwritten on a card, her lines about planning like rain will fail and hoping like rain will come. So kids can read the same thing I did and understand that the work is part instruction and part love. We'll mount those old photos Ruth brought and make a small corner of the garden a history wall so people who walk by can see that this place has always been for the community. Fall will be cover crops and seed saving. We'll hold a seed swap where people bring packets and stories. We'll stage an annual open day with tour led by neighbors, Elena, Agnes, a teacher, so the stories are told by people who live here, not by one person trying to sell a version of the future. I want those tours to be about the beds and the compost and the kids learning, not about me. The Trust will publish a short yearly report that lists volunteer hours and expenses and plans for the next season. Transparency is part of Trust. We have practical plans too, a simple irrigation check each spring, a tool repair fund, and training for anyone who wants to run a plot so we avoid conflicts. The trustees will meet quarterly and post minutes. The $1 story will be told there as a lesson in precision, how records and witnesses matter more than loud promises. I imagine neighbors telling that story at potlucks as an example of how small, steady work holds a place that grand gestures can't buy. The garden will be a place where proof and patience grow together, and I'll keep doing the quiet things that make that possible. If you have a family story like this, share it in the comments. Subscribe and switch on notifications. There are more stories where silence becomes strategy and truth finds a microphone.